For 2 years, I became an expert at hiding the truth. Long sleeves in the summer, fake smiles in every family photo, excuses that sounded believable enough to stop people from asking questions. I thought I had fooled everyone, until my uncle came home after 15 years away. During a goodbye hug, my sleeve slipped just enough for him to see what I'd spent years hiding. He never looked at my husband. He never asked who did it. Instead, he quietly whispered, "Don't tell anyone. Tomorrow at 8, I'll prove you're not trapped anymore." I had no idea that those 11 words were about to save my life. My name is Emma Carter, and I'm 30 years old. If you had met me 2 years ago, you probably would have called me lucky. I had married a successful man named Ryan, lived in a beautiful suburban home, and smiled in every family photo we ever posted online. From the outside, our marriage looked almost perfect. The truth was something I became an expert at hiding. Ryan never started by hurting me physically. First came the criticism. He questioned how I dressed, who I talked to, and how I spent my time. Slowly, every decision I made needed his approval. When I argued, he apologized afterward, promising it would never happen again. I believed him because I wanted to believe the man I had fallen in love with was still there somewhere. But the promises slowly disappeared. Whenever the arguments became worse, I found myself inventing excuses for the bruises that occasionally appeared on my arms and shoulders. I blamed clumsiness, slippery stairs, heavy boxes, anything that sounded believable enough to stop people from asking more questions. Long sleeves became part of my wardrobe, even during the hottest summer afternoons. Little by little, I stopped answering friends' calls. Family gatherings became rare because Ryan always had a reason why we couldn't stay long. After enough time passed, nobody questioned our distance anymore. Then everything changed. My uncle, David Carter, returned to America after spending 15 years working overseas. The entire family planned a welcome dinner, and Ryan insisted we attend. I spent nearly an hour covering every mark I could find with makeup before pulling on another long-sleeve dress. For a while, I believed my act was working. Then, as everyone said their goodbyes, Uncle David hugged me tightly. My sleeve slipped back only an inch. His eyes stopped on my arm. He didn't say a single word, but in that silent moment, I knew he'd seen everything. Uncle David released me from the hug as if nothing unusual had happened. He smiled at everyone gathered near the front door, thanked my mother for dinner, and even complimented Ryan on the grilled steaks. Watching him act so normally almost convinced me I'd imagined the look in his eyes. Then, while Ryan walked outside to bring the car around, my uncle stepped beside me. Without looking directly at my bruised arm, he quietly slipped a folded business card into my hand. "Tomorrow," he whispered, 8 o'clock. "Be ready." That was all he said before walking away. I barely slept that night. The card stayed hidden beneath my pillow while my thoughts raced in circles. Did he really know? Was he guessing? Had he already told the rest of the family? Every possible outcome terrified me far more than keeping my secret. Ryan noticed something was wrong before breakfast. "You've been quiet since dinner," he said, studying my face. "Did your uncle say something to you?" I forced a smile and shook my head. "He just asked about work." Ryan stared at me for another moment before finally nodding. "Good. I don't like people interfering in our marriage." The words settled heavily in the room. After he left for work, I pulled out the business card. On the back, Uncle David had written only 4 words. "Trust me, 8 sharp." For nearly an hour, I stood by the bedroom window debating whether to ignore him. Ryan had spent years convincing me that asking for help would only make everything worse. Maybe he was right. Maybe leaving would only create bigger problems. At exactly 8 the next morning, a black SUV stopped quietly outside the house. Uncle David stepped out wearing jeans and a simple navy jacket, looking completely calm. I climbed into the passenger seat without saying a word. As we pulled away from the curb, I realized we weren't driving toward my parents' house. We were heading somewhere I had never been before. For the first 10 minutes, neither of us spoke. Uncle David kept both hands on the steering wheel, letting the silence settle instead of filling it with questions. I kept staring out the passenger window, wondering if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. Finally, He broke the silence. "You don't owe me an explanation, Emma," he said gently. "I already know enough to understand you're living in fear." My eyes filled with tears. No one had ever said those words aloud before. Instead of driving to my parents' house, he parked outside a quiet office building on the edge of town. There were no flashing signs, no crowds, nothing that would attract attention. It looked like any ordinary professional building. Inside, a kind woman greeted us with a warm smile and offered me coffee. Uncle David introduced her simply as someone who helped people safely explore their options during difficult situations. Not once did anyone pressure me to make a decision. Instead, they listened. For nearly 2 hours, I spoke more honestly than I had in years. I described how Ryan slowly isolated me, controlled our finances, criticized everything I did, and convinced me nobody would ever believe my side of the story. Every time I expected doubt or judgment, I found calm understanding instead. When I finally stopped talking, Uncle David looked at me. "I spent 15 years working with families facing impossible situations," he said quietly. "Fear always tells people they're trapped. The truth is, they're usually not." For the first time in 2 years, I believed that might actually be true. Together, we carefully discussed practical next steps, important documents, trusted contacts, and ways to protect my privacy without creating unnecessary conflict. Nothing happened impulsively. Every decision was thoughtful and deliberate. As we prepared to leave, my phone suddenly lit up. Ryan's name appeared on the screen. Then another call, and another. Somehow, he already knew I wasn't where he expected me to be. I silenced Ryan's calls, but they kept coming. 5 missed calls became 10. Then came a stream of text messages that shifted from confusion to anger in less than an hour. "Where are you? Why aren't you answering? You need to come home right now." I stared at the screen without replying. For years, I would have rushed to explain myself, terrified of making him even more upset. This time, I simply placed the phone face down on the table. Uncle David noticed. "You don't have to answer until you're ready," he said calmly. Those words felt strangely unfamiliar. For the first time in years, someone wasn't telling me what I had to do. Instead, they were reminding me that I actually had a choice. Over the next several days, everything moved carefully and quietly. With guidance from experienced professionals, I gathered important documents, copied financial records that belonged to me, and wrote down dates and memories I'd tried so hard to forget. Seeing everything organized on paper made me realize this wasn't a series of isolated incidents. It was a pattern that had slowly taken over my life. Meanwhile, Ryan continued trying to control the situation. He called my parents, insisting I had overreacted after a simple argument. He told relatives I was emotionally overwhelmed and just needed time to calm down. But this time, his version of events didn't go unquestioned. Uncle David never argued with him. He never raised his voice or traded accusations. Whenever family members asked what was happening, he simply encouraged them not to rush to conclusions and reminded them that every story has more than one side. His quiet confidence made people pause. For once, they started asking me how I was instead of assuming everything was fine. Just when I thought Ryan might finally accept that I wasn't coming back, a message appeared on my phone. "Emma, please meet me one last time. I just want a chance to explain everything." I read Ryan's message at least 20 times before locking my phone. Part of me wanted to ignore it completely. Another part remembered the man I had fallen in love with years earlier and wondered if this meeting might finally bring the apology I'd waited so long to hear. When Uncle David noticed my hesitation, he didn't tell me what to do. Instead, he poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from me. "If you choose to meet him," he said, "make sure you're doing it because it gives you peace, not because you feel guilty." Those words stayed with me all morning. I eventually agreed to meet Ryan in a quiet public cafe during the afternoon. The moment he saw me, his expression softened. "I've made mistakes," he admitted. "I know I haven't been easy to live with, but we can fix this. I'll change. I'll do whatever you want. Just come home." A year earlier, those promises would have broken every wall I'd built around my heart. Now, they sounded painfully familiar. I remembered every apology that had been followed by another argument, every promise that quietly disappeared, every excuse I had made for behavior that never truly changed. Instead of answering immediately, I opened the small notebook I'd started keeping after leaving home. Each page contained memories I'd forced myself to write down before fear convinced me they weren't real. As I read them, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Ryan wasn't offering me a new future. He was offering me the same past with different words. I closed the notebook and looked at him calmly. "I truly hope you become the person you're promising to be," I said. "But I can't keep sacrificing myself while waiting for that day." For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I stood up. Outside the cafe, Uncle David was waiting beside his truck. As I climbed inside, he smiled gently and said, "Emma, real love should never make you afraid." For the first time in years, I believed him. 6 months after I walked out of that house, my life looked completely different. I rented a small apartment with sunlight pouring through the living room windows every morning. It wasn't nearly as large as the house Ryan and I had shared, but every corner belonged to me. Every decision, from the color of the curtains to the pictures hanging on the walls, was finally mine to make. I returned to work full-time and slowly reconnected with friends I hadn't spoken to in years. None of them judged me for disappearing. Instead, they welcomed me back with more kindness than I thought I deserved. Once a week, I met with a therapist who helped me understand something I had never realized before. Healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning that someone else's choices didn't define my worth. Some days were still difficult. Certain songs reminded me of the past. Unexpected phone notifications made my heart race before I remembered Ryan could no longer reach me. But those moments became less frequent with every passing month. Then, one Saturday afternoon, Uncle David invited me to lunch before leaving for another overseas assignment. We sat on a quiet park bench with sandwiches and coffee, watching children play nearby. "I've been thinking," I told him. "If you hadn't seen those bruises that day, I'd probably still be hiding everything." He smiled but slowly shook his head. "I opened a door, Emma," he replied. "You were the one who found the courage to walk through it." I looked down, letting those words settle in my heart. For so long, I had believed I was weak because I stayed. Now I understood something much more important. Leaving had required more courage than staying ever had. Before saying goodbye, Uncle David hugged me one last time. "This isn't the end of your story," he said. "It's the beginning of the life you finally get to choose." After he drove away, I stood there smiling through grateful tears. Today, when I look in a mirror, I don't see someone defined by fear or by the painful years I tried so hard to hide. I see someone who survived, someone who healed, someone who learned that asking for help isn't weakness. It is often the first step toward freedom. If you're carrying a secret that makes you feel completely alone, I hope you remember this. Sometimes, all it takes is one person who truly sees you to remind you that your life can still become something beautiful.